going to be a quick one. We summarize a lot of the information that we've already covered at some level of detail already. But as always, I mean, if you guys have questions, make sure that you jump in on these and ask those questions real time. We'll try our best to address those. All right. Now, I have spoken all week long about the enterprise risk management organization. As I told you guys earlier, that has become a movement, as it were, with medium and large size organizations, especially that are formalizing the whole enterprise risk management division into a standalone autonomous department and division, oftentimes led by the likes of a CISO or a CSO or an ISSO. Fully autonomous, not reporting up through the IT division anymore. I have even seen in the past risk management entities that are reporting up through the chief financial officer. But this is a standalone, fully funded autonomous department and division, not beholden, as it were, to any other department or division. Now, we've spoken quite a bit about risk and the vulnerabilities that those risks are actually associated with. When we do a vulnerability assessment, and that's some of the software that I gave you guys links to earlier in the week, the Open Vulnerability Assessment Software, Open VAS, open source, free. I also told you about the Nessus utility from the company called Tenable. Commercial product, very good vulnerability assessment package. And it can link dynamically with and be associated with multiple database engines that are marked up and feed the signature database of those pieces, so that they have access almost real time to the most well-known and up-to-date exploits and vulnerabilities for very specific enterprise type of environments there. Every time you discover a vulnerability in a particular environment, you more often than not will identify multiple risks that are in some way associated with that vulnerability, along with the threats and the threat actors. And then gives you more information that identifies the specific type of risk. Now, we see all different types of attacks, and we've already mentioned several of those as the week goes along here. We spoke in pretty good detail about malware, malicious software, and the different types of malware, viruses, Trojans, worms, logic bombs, things like that. We also talked about the risks and the risk actors, the threat actors, being either internal threats, insider threats, external threats, as well as being associated with human-caused malicious types of threats, or those that are completely accidental, users not being trained properly, or untoward events like hurricanes, floods, things like that. But we also find risks that are associated in many, many cases, as a matter of fact, from misconfiguration. Users installing systems, hardware, software, applications, operating systems, and just not understanding them well enough so that they are configured with security in mind, security as a guiding principle rather than as an afterthought. Okay. We also talked about doing your risk assessment. Risks are assessed and evaluated based on those two very important factors. What is the likelihood of the risk? And that's usually a quantitative value, 1 to 10, 1 to 20. And then the second value is the impact or the consequences of the risk, also usually a quantitative value, dollars and cents. Most organizations now, you will find, do a sort of a hybrid approach as far as risk assessment. It's a hybrid between both quantitative analysis, figures, values, and qualitative analysis. And that's very subjective. It uses scenarios, verbiage, even color coding. Like there's a color coding concept that's used oftentimes to present data called traffic light protocol. Red, yellow, and green. Red is critical. We got to do something about it right now. Green is A-OK, no problems there. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, risk assessment is something that we must do on a regular basis. And then we have to determine then how we are going to manage the risks that we uncover during our vulnerability, threat, and risk assessment processes. Remember, I told you there's 4 ways to manage risk, and there are risks that are involved or inherent in any system. And the old mentioned before as well, the greater the reward, absolutely true. Organizations that have a higher risk appetite or risk tolerance, well, they're the ones that can get more reward by assuming that particular risk and managing that risk properly. We talked about the evaluation of the risk, and here's one way, and this uses that traffic light protocol I was talking about, the red, yellow, and green. This is a heat map or a heat register, if you will. There are all types of online facilities where you can download these template type structures for painting a heat map or setting up a threat or a heat register or a risk register there as well. Here that, this one, personally, I would extend this on out several other columns on the spreadsheet. But this tells me, basically identifies what the risk factor itself is in this case. Not having antivirus, anti-malware software, staff that is not trained properly, or older systems like we're talking about, older legacy Windows operating systems or older legacy hardware. So we figure out, again, from the risk perspective, what is the overall impact, and is it high, medium, or low? And that typically from a quantitative value is how much is it going to cost me? We also then look at they call it ARO, the annual rate of occurrence. And I use that along with what we refer to as a single loss expectancy. Single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence equals annual loss expectancy, annualized loss expectancy, dollars and cents. Okay. Then we have to do a balancing act. We have to weigh. Once we evaluate the risk and determine that we are going to mitigate the risk, we have to know what the cost of the controls are. And I'm talking about total cost of ownership, TCO. And there's a relatively new term we start here now. We've heard forever, what's the ROI? What's the return on the investment? Well, from a security aspect, now you're going to start hearing what is the ROSI, the return on security investment. Okay. The way that we determine how we're going to manage the risk is very important as well. I mentioned to you the 4 ways that we manage risk. You can avoid the risk altogether. Somebody's telling me the only way that you avoid risk. What is it? You guys know the answer. Go ahead, William.
Not do the risky behavior.
That's right. Stop doing the risky behavior. Whatever the risky behavior is, in order to avoid it, stop it. Okay. 99% of the time, that's just simply not an option. So you then have to determine what other of these 3 ways am I going to use to manage the risk. Remember, I can transfer the risk to a third party, business associate, or transfer it to an insurance policy, that kind of thing. Anyway, some third party entity that's going to manage the risk for me or to assume the risk, as it were. I can accept the risk. And again, I'm not ignoring it. I'm fully aware that the risk is there. It's just that I have determined that our risk appetite, our risk tolerance is high enough that I'm not worried about this vulnerability and risk, even if it occurs, put me out of business. I can manage that. And then to mitigate the risk, I decide to spend the time, effort, and resources required in order to lessen the impact or lessen the likelihood. And going back to the previous screen, that would be what is the cost of the controls? That's just one of the factors to consider when I'm going to mitigate the risk. Okay. And then I determine and, move on. What is the overall impact of the risk? And that also plays into what my risk appetite or risk tolerance as an organization happens to be as well. I have to understand that there is, even after I put in controls, there are risks that still remain. Now, I may have been able to successfully lessen the likelihood or lessen the impact, but the risk still is there. So from that, I manage it. Okay? There's always residual risk, always risk left over. Because remember, the only way to eliminate risk, stop doing the risky behavior. That's all there is to it. And if indeed, like I say, my organization has a high enough risk tolerance or risk appetite, I can successfully then decide how I'm going to manage and or mitigate that risk. You see, the first thing I have to do as far as managing risk is to identify the risk. I do that, like I said, with my vulnerability assessment software, my vulnerability assessment process. I figure out where the vulnerabilities are in my systems. And again, I've got all types of outside resources that I can pull in to give me those risk signatures, those vulnerability signatures, as well as to assist me in telling, what type of risk it is, where does it reside in my organization, and then all types of outside information to show me even case studies of how other organizations that may be like mine have actually managed the risk. But it all goes back to what my risk tolerance is and what is going to be the proper methodology that I put in place to manage that risk. Okay. And again, a successful management may be accepting the risk if indeed my risk appetite is high enough, my risk tolerance is high enough. Now, on the risk register I was talking about, I fully defined what the vulnerability and the description of the risk that's associated with it. I want to then either paint that heat map, color-coded heat map, or the quantitative. The risk is, and 1 out of 10, it's a 5, or it's a 4, or it's a 9. I want to assign the risk to a specific inside the organization, a specific owner. The risk may be associated with a specific department or division. So the ownership there. I then take that risk apart and do business impact analysis. If it goes down, what's it going to cost me? How long is that line of business, whatever, going to be offline? Are there tertiary impacts that it may have? Sort of the domino effect, if indeed. Does it affect internal only, or may it affect external partners, external vendors, distributors, suppliers, etc.? So the heat map and doing the further threat, risk, and vulnerability analysis is how I determined all of this, and it also assists me in deciding how I'm going to manage the risk. Now, there are certain levels or thresholds of risk assessment that I need to figure out to help me determine what is indeed acceptable, what my risk tolerance is. If it goes over a certain impact or consequence, well, then I may need to look at it a little bit differently then and manage it quite differently there. All right, hold on just a sec, folks. Luigi, I see you have joined the party here as an audit student, and welcome, by the way. I want to encourage you while you are here to feel free to participate. If you have any questions, you just jump right in and ask those. You can type it in your chat box. You can turn your mic on and ask it. I welcome those. Don't consider it an interruption. I consider it an opportunity to learn some new stuff and to maybe pass on some information as well. So welcome. Enjoy your stay here. And I'll give you my email address too while I'm at it. If when you leave us, you think of anything that you think about after the fact, here's my email address. Feel free to use it. I always return emails. Okay. So risk management is basically this threefold process here. I figure out what my appetite, my risk threshold happens to be. I very carefully analyze and evaluate what my risk indicators are, what my indicators of compromise, indicators of attack. And I was talking to, there are multiple areas out on the World Wide Web where I can download these very cool template type of structures, spreadsheets, guidance documentation, where I can create these risk registers. And of course, you can add on to it. Once you have determined what the risk might happen to be, once you have determined your organization's risk appetite and tolerance, then you begin to build a profile of what would be acceptable and not acceptable risk as far as your organization goes. And then you begin to manage the risk. Okay. There are certain areas inside the organization that may, prefer to handle risk one way, and then areas in the organization handle risk a different way. It really all boils down to how the risk affects that specific department or division. Now, I talked about BIA, the business impact analysis. This is a great little chart here, and something very important that we have to think about. There's a couple of terms here you guys will need to be aware of when you start getting ready to do your certification exam. Recovery time objective, recovery point objective, work recovery time, and very, very important, maximum tolerable downtime. Anytime you have any type of incident that interrupts your normal mode of doing business, some people would consider it a complete disaster. Some people would consider it a hiccup in the road. Either way you look at it, there are certain things you need to consider. And a lot of these milestones need to be, and these values need to be determined prior to any kind of incident occurring. Very important that you understand when any type of incident occurs, let's call it a crash of a system. Well, first, and we talked about it the first couple of days of the class, you have to understand what the baselining of all of your critical systems are. In order to do that, you have to initially identify your mission and business critical assets. Okay, servers, systems, databases, people, places, buildings, everything, even the processes, including, for instance, your data backups, things like that. To assure that your mission and business critical assets are available to allow you the business of doing business. Anytime an incident occurs, we'll call it a disaster. That's a stake in your chronological timeline. The clock starts tipping there. Okay. Further on down that chronological timeline here, there's another stake in the ground that's called MTD. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, for each and every one of your critical systems, and I'm including hardware, software configurations, and very importantly, your data resources. For each and every one of your hardware, software, technology systems, you have to predetermine what the recovery time objective is. And that's the time that it would take me to reconstitute that system, to get it either repaired, replaced, or put a workaround in place so that I can still have that function in my ability to do business end to end. Recovery time objective, remember that. The recovery point objective is basically defining how much data or what my frequency of data I need to keep so that I can roll back to good data. How long is it before my data starts getting stale? Okay. So if I have to have refreshed data, let's say every 24 hours, okay, then I better be backing up my data every 24 hours because that's my rollback point. Now, I might miss a day's worth of processing, but I can restore my data back to that point and continue doing business. That's called the recovery point objective. Okay. And then once I get all my systems reconstituted, once I get my data restored, there's still a lag of time called the work recovery time. That's how we human critters need to take to get re-engaged with the whole process end to end. And I am targeting towards that very important state that's further down in the chronological timeline, because I want you to understand this. On the other side of maximum tolerable downtime is out of business. Very important that we understand that. So, I have to identify what my mission and business critical systems are. I have to determine for each and every one of those, how long would it take me to reconstitute if it just fell off the face of the planet? And then for my data resources, my ability to process information, how much of that can I stand to lose and still stay in business? So that also, like I say, should determine my backup process. Okay. Let's see, who is that? Junaid, I guess that is. Also, welcome to the party. I want you to feel free as well to jump in and ask questions while you're here. I welcome those, and I hope you enjoy the time that you are here with us. So this is how we do business impact analysis. Once I identify all those critical systems, then I have to work for each and every one of those along this timeline. I do not want to hit that maximum tolerable downtime and still have critical systems that are not at the very least 85, 90% functional. Okay. So I have to continue my business of doing business. That's all part of threat management, vulnerability assessment, impact analysis, continuity of operations planning, even to the point, remember I told you guys that this standalone enterprise risk management division may have dotted lines to IT and IS. That even has to do with perhaps IT contingency planning as well. So we have to swim in that pond as well, so to speak. Now, just about every organization out there has some type of vendor dependency, supply chain dependency there. We want to make certain that we manage the vendors very carefully. You do not want to be in a situation where you are vendor locked into a singular vendor. You don't want to be doing business with vendors that may violate some of your other service level agreements, non-disclosure agreements, conflicts of interest out there. So you have to very, very carefully scrutinize the vendors that you are indeed going to be doing business with. In doing that vendor assessment and selection of vendors, you may be bound by some type of rules, regulation, and compliance force of law to maintain multiple vendors. Like I say, you don't want to be vendor locked. And then some particular business agreements that you have, especially if you're dealing with government institutions and organizations, and then financial institutions, those kind of things, care institutions. Some of the business partnership agreements there require that specific pieces of equipment, specific software, audits are required now and again. So sometimes those relationships are handed down by compliance rules and regulations there. So you have to know what those are to avoid even any semblance of any conflict of interest there. And again, being vendor locked to a singular vendor is not a good idea talking about just businesses doing business, but it's also not a good idea from a security perspective. You always want to have a fallback in case one vendor all of a sudden don't love you anymore or they go out of business. Okay. And I'll tell you another thing too, it's very difficult at times to do this. And sometimes the vendors just not going to have it. Now, if it were my company and I went to a vendor and said, look, we're doing our vulnerability and a threat assessment in our organization because of our network relationship, we need to push our vulnerability and threat assessment into your if you can't have that, I'm saying, okay, bye. I'll find another couple of vendors that will allow that because I want my environment to be extremely secure. And I need to evaluate and secure and assure that security up and down my supply chain as well. And I'll give you an example of that. You guys are probably aware of data breach that happened here almost 5 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. That came from a third-party vendor. Somebody compromised a workstation inside one of the Target store's vendors and used that as a launching pad to dive right into their data center. And still to this day, there are hundreds of thousands of bits of customer data being sold out on the dark web. My wife's being one of those. Okay. So you have to push your vulnerability assessment and even the auditing functionality inside of many business partnership relationship documents now. They have the right to audit clause in there, so it's enforced. Okay. And then in addition to that, you need to do constant monitoring of your vendors, not just vendor, but anybody up and down your supply chain. Okay. There are a whole host of different legal documents, legal agreements that we see that are exchanged between business partners. And now we're seeing sort of sort of an aggregation, if you will, of many of these different legal agreements that are basically rolled into a memorandum of understanding or a business partnership agreement. And it may have individual clauses that address things such as the service level agreement, the non-disclosure agreement, the interconnect security agreement, those kind of things, all rolled into a singular contract and agreement as individual clauses. One very important thing, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we were talking about the going over the pen testing, is the rules of engagement documentation. Rules of engagement defines what the both sides of the equation, what the expectations are. The rules of engagement document should be absolutely required to be signed off on. And I worked with a company that we did this. We did vulnerability assessment, pen testing, and we didn't even think about beginning the engagement until that rules of engagement documentation was signed, sealed, and delivered. And we always tried our best to go after the highest C-suite employee in the organization we could, to get them to be, in essence, the champion that was supporting the penetration testing that we were doing there. So these are just a few of the legal documents, and well, some of them legally enforceable, some of them not so much. But in North America, you guys have certainly seen the legalese. You know, at the beginning of the contract, it'll say something to the effect of, for such and such and such, and the exchange of $1, this is a legally enforceable document in this jurisdiction, kind of thing. So again, lots of those are rolled into a singular business partnership agreement of some sort. Some of them are completely legally enforceable in the jurisdiction, some of them not so much. Now, in addition to making certain that we set up and everybody clearly understands what the rules of engagement are there are, and again, this is dependent oftentimes on the type of organization or enterprise you work with or for, there may be requirements for doing some type of auditing or assessment, either internal or external. I know in the financial and the medical community, there are regular audits that are required just to keep their business license. And then in many different types of industry, it's industry best practices. I mean, if you want to be a member of the club, you got to go through these attestation audits, either internal or both in some cases. So as a security practitioner, we need to understand what the implications there are as well. Now, I mentioned to you guys earlier in the week, we were talking about the vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment is the first phase of it. That's more of a passive side of thing where we do reconnaissance type of information and try to figure out as much detail as we possibly can about the organization who is the target, as well as the employees and the business partners of that organization. It's more of an observation, open source intelligence gathering, and even doing some, more passive type of observation and intelligence gathering on the social networking sites, the who's who catalogs, publications, advertisements, the company websites themselves, that kind of thing. And then the second part of that, to actually further the case, is doing the full-on penetration test. The company I worked with for about 6.5, not quite 7 years, we did those kind of exercises. And then there were several times over that period of time, a couple of dozen actually, where we were doing penetration tests completely in the blind, where the target organization, the client organization, there was only a handful of people in the entire enterprise that were even aware that the pen test was going on. And I mean, we did some under the cover stuff there, some very covert operations, as far as we learned how to and did. So, you have to be cautious not to step over ethical boundaries, ethical lines in the sand, so to speak. But everything is clearly laid out and defined, the whole playing field defined in the rules of engagement documentation. And many, many times inside of those engagements, we were doing red team, blue team, facilitated type of engagements where the penetration testers were actually employees, and the guardians against the pen test were employees. So we had the blue team, the guardians, they had the red team that were attackers. And in lots of cases, they were exchanging information during the entire enterprise. So it was a very scenario-based, facilitated kind of thing. Those were lots of fun too. Now, there are three basic types of penetration testing, and they call them black box testing, gray box testing, white box testing. The black box testing is as if you are an outside entity. There is, again, you don't have a whole lot of information about the organization. You have to do the very first phase, full reconnaissance, try to find as much detailed information as you can. That's where we actually use tools like you guys have used this week already, the packet grabbers, the Wireshark, the Nmap, those kinds of tools. And then we employ tools like command insertion, SQL interactive, that kind of the lab that you guys did, to try to physically gain access to host machines. That whole pivoting function, taking that logical look around, moving from one host to another, the lateral movement we talked about, and compromising as many host machines as possible throughout the larger network. And all along the way, dropping the little backdoor programs or the RATs, the remote access Trojan, script level programs, things like that. So now those are a lot of fun. I mean, a lot of fun. That's some of the most fun I ever had in professional life. But the color type of exercises, red team, blue team, facilitated, those are a lot of fun too. And those always ended up as being, really in-depth type of facilitated learning processes and procedures, which the learning and education has been a big, big joy for me for 40 years now, 30 years. So I really enjoyed those. So that is overall pen testing concepts. Now, these are two labs here that I would absolutely recommend you guys go through. Now, if you plan on going and getting the Pen Test Plus class, then they concentrate a lot more on this in the certification exam. Not so much in this one, but these are fun. I mean, you use tools, many of which we've already talked about this week, to actually do some of these penetration testing functions. Nmap, TCP dump, Angry IP scanner, Wireshark, lots of those tools we have spoken about already. Even the some of the tool functions in the Metasploit exploitation framework. So that's the stuff I've given you guys the links to already this week.